Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're opening up really a key book from the mid-20th century, Irrational Man, a study in existential philosophy by William Barrett.
And it's a significant work, definitely.
Yeah.
Credited with really, bringing European existentialism more into the mainstream in America after World War II. Barrett himself, he was a New Yorker, philosophy professor at NYU, PhD from Columbia, also a respected editor and critic.
The sources we're working with are straight from the book itself, excerpts. And Barrett's goal, it seems, wasn't just purely academic. He wanted to connect these big philosophical ideas with, well, the messy, concrete reality of modern life.
Exactly. He saw philosophy not as something just for academics, but as a crucial way to understand the world we actually live in.
So our mission here in this deep dive is to explore Barrett's view on existentialism, where he thinks it came from, how it helps make sense of things like modern art, and what it tells us about being human today. Let's jump in and unpack this.
Okay, so Barrett starts by setting the scene, describing what he calls the present age. What's the main feeling he identifies there?
He talks about this pervasive anxiety, almost a sense of panic, really. He was writing in the atomic age, of course, which, well, that added a terrifying layer of uncertainty. But he suggests the anxiety goes deeper.
Right. And his argument is that modern civilization, for all its power and, complexity, it actually tends to avoid the fundamental questions about existence itself.
How does it do that?
Well, we lean towards abstraction, don't we? We focus on technology, rely on numbers, quantitative data, sort of anything that gives a feeling of control or distance, rather than facing the inner depth of what it means to actually be.
Which is exactly where existentialism comes in, according to Barrett.
That's its core point, yeah. It insists that abstract thinking, rational intelligence is just not enough. We have to face the urgent reality of our specific concrete experience, our inner life. Barrett uses that Kierkegaard story,
Yeah.
the absent-minded
Oh,
man.
right. The one who suddenly wakes up to himself.
Exactly. He lives almost unconsciously, then boom, he realizes he exists. Barrett uses it to show that concrete experience is about truly living your existence, not just analyzing it from the outside.
That paints a clear picture, and he points to some, well, maybe unexpected sources for existentialism's rise beyond the usual suspects.
Yeah, he mentions Russian thinkers like Soloviev, Shestov, Berdoyev, and connects them back to Dostoevsky. He sees their perspective as total extreme and apocalyptic. They found no easy middle ground between rationalism and, say, the spirit of religion. It's this intense, sometimes anti-rationalist, faith-driven way of grappling with big questions that he sees feeding into existential themes.
Okay, so this background of anxiety and sort of avoiding the inner life leads to what he calls the encounter with nothingness.
Yes. He suggests the modern age is incredibly self-conscious. We're flooded with information, especially through journalism, which he sees as becoming almost godlike, constantly updating us, but often superficially. This outer noise and inner kind of over-analysis creates this huge tension and anxiety.
It feels like the sheer force of modern society, driven by rational organization, production, technology like cars, radio, TV. It speeds everything up, but pushes us outward.
Exactly. He calls it a profound externalization of life. Things are faster, more connected globally, but you feel maybe increasingly detached from any sense of inner substance or belonging.
And he connects this back to the whole Enlightenment project.
He does. He argues the Enlightenment tried to get rid of mystery, which led to the triumph of capitalism and this focus on reason and progress. But then World War I, in his view, just exposed the bankruptcy of that purely rational bourgeois way of life. It was a human debacle, showing that reason hadn't led to peace, but to, well, unimaginable destruction.
That really fits with the Henry James quote he uses about the treacherous years making meaning too tragic for words.
It's a powerful line, isn't it? Marks a real shift, a loss of that earlier optimism. We entered this more secular time where people felt increasingly stripped, cut off from nature, from traditional religion, feeling alienated, lonely. This is the setting for what he sometimes calls the irrational man, adrift in mass society.
Sort of unmoored, lacking a clear place. And it's interesting he points out how even in the supposed heartlands of reason, like modern science and math, limits started showing up.
Right, he brings up Gödel's findings. Gödel basically showed that within any formal mathematical system, there are true statements you just can't prove using that system. Barrett sees this as hinting that a completely finished, totally rational system explaining everything. Well, maybe that's just not possible for human existence. Reason bumps up against its own limits.
And art then becomes a kind of response to this situation.
Absolutely. Modern art, for Barrett, is an attempt to get back to sources, to something authentic, instead of relying on the pre-packaged abstract forms at the time. This sort of painful stripping down of modern life can, maybe paradoxically, reveal something raw and essential about the human drama.
That's a great transition to looking at what he calls the testimony of modern art. It's often seen as difficult, right? A real break from the past.
He acknowledges that, yeah. The Philistine view, as he puts it, often finds modern art shocking or just nonsensical. But he argues it's not just artists being weird for the sake of it. This shift reflects that spiritual poverty of the age. It's a deliberate attempt to break from abstraction and connect with real things and feelings.
Like you see in Hemingway's style, maybe. That very stripped-down way of writing.
Exactly like that. The sources point out how the old Western tradition of humanism, which had provided a kind of cultural backbone for centuries, was felt to be declining. So modern artists started looking elsewhere, to Asian art, African art, for new ways to express this changed reality.
And you see it dramatically in painting compared to, say, the Renaissance with its focus on perspective and solid forms.
Yeah, modern art often features this flattening of space, a turn inward. Think about cubism, breaking objects down. Barrett interprets that as a kind of detachment from the external object itself, a move towards exploring internal reality. He argues this growing subjectivity isn't just a style choice, it's a psychological compensation for that outward rush, that externalization of life we talked about. It's a kind of revolt.
So the modern artist, as Barrett sees it, is facing a world where that traditional ladder, the connection between earth and God or some higher reality, it feels like it's gone.
Right, he uses that incredible Yeats quote, "Now that my ladder's gone, I must lie down where all ladders start, in the foul rag-and-bone shop of the heart." The artist confronts this flat and inexplicable world, and the important journey isn't upwards anymore, but inwards into the self and immediate experience.
And this flattening and ditching of traditional structure, it wasn't just in painting, was it? It happened in literature, too.
Oh, absolutely. Think of writers like Joyce, Eliot, Pound. Their work often messes with traditional plots, linear time, clear endings. Barrett sees this mirroring a loss of faith in a neatly ordered, rational universe. Instead, small details, even seemingly trivial things, take on huge significance because the big overarching meaning isn't there anymore.
Faulkner's way of handling time seems really relevant here.
It really does. Faulkner's time isn't clock time, is it? It's fragmented, looping, almost primal. Barrett actually connects this to Heidegger's ideas about time being fundamental to how we exist, not just something we measure.
There's also that interesting comparison E.M. Forster makes with Oriental music.
Yes, in A Passage to India, Forster describes this music that doesn't really have a clear beginning, middle, or end, unlike Western music, which builds to a climax. Barrett uses this to point out a deeper philosophical difference. Maybe an Eastern tendency to accept existence as it is, without needing a built-in purpose or meaning, versus the Western drive for structure and significance. Modern art, with its fragmentation, sometimes echoes that acceptance of a world without a pre-written script.
So, far from being just difficult or strange, modern art is actually offering a powerful testimony about what it felt like to live in that modern age.
That's his argument. It reflects the anxiety, the fragmentation, the loss of old certainties, and the search for authenticity in a world that can feel unreal or meaningless. It really challenges our basic ideas about humanity and reality.
Okay, so Barrett's laid out the crisis of the modern age and how art reflects it. Now he shifts gears a bit, showing these themes aren't entirely new, that they have deep sources in the Western tradition. He starts with that contrast between Hebraism and Hellenism.
Right. He looks at these two major currents in Western thought. Hebraism, coming from the Old Testament, is centered on the law, on faith, and on this very direct, passionate, sometimes argumentative relationship with God. Think of the book of Job, literally arguing with God. It's concrete, personal.
Which is very different from the Greek philosophical way.
Totally different. Hellenism, Greek philosophy, it's focused on abstract reason, theoretical knowledge, pursuing the bios theoreticos, that life of contemplation, understanding universal truths through logic.
And existentialism then kind of pushes back against that Greek focus on the universal over the specific individual.
It does, in a way. Barrett says it partly flips the Platonic scale of values. Plato thought the abstract forms were the most real thing. Existentialists like Kierkegaard and later Nietzsche, they put the emphasis squarely on concrete, individual existence, my existence, right here, right now. rather than abstract universals.
Then he moves on to Christian sources.
Christianity, as Barrett presents it, inherits this ongoing tension, this struggle between faith and reason, pulling from both Hebraic and Hellenic traditions. You have St. Paul saying faith is foolishness to the Greeks. Figures like St. Augustine deeply wrestled with balancing faith and philosophy. And Pascal is key here too, emphasizing the limits of reason when facing the big questions about the human condition, arguing for the necessity of faith, the reasons of the heart.
So Kierkegaard doesn't just pop out of nowhere. He's really central to this specific Christian line of thought, navigating faith versus reason.
Absolutely. Kierkegaard zooms in on the paradoxes of Christianity and the unique subjective position of the individual facing these huge choices. Choices that might even demand a suspension of the ethical, a leap of faith beyond normal moral rules like Abraham and Isaac. His idea of subjective truth, the truth that I am, is vital. It's not detached knowledge, it's truth that you live. That becomes real for you in your own struggle.
He then brings in that allegory from Swift, the flight from Laputa.
Ah, yes, Swift's brilliant satire in Gulliver's Travels. Laputa, the floating island of intellectuals totally lost in abstract math and music theory, completely neglecting the practical world below. They need servants just to remind them to pay attention. Barrett sees it as a perfect symbol of how abstract thought can become dangerously cut off from actual life.
And that kind of detachment provoked a reaction, didn't it?
It certainly did. Following Swift, you get the Romantic movement, which was, in large part, a protest against that growing rationalism and the Industrial Revolution. The Romantics explored nature, individual feelings, imagination, the irrational world, all the stuff pure reason tended to sideline. Think of Wordsworth railing against the meddling intellect. The Faust myth is another example Barrett uses, exploring human striving, ambition, and those darker hidden forces that reason can't fully control. Though he does contrast Wordsworth's more benign view with Rimbaud's darker vision, which he sees as pointing towards a more violent era of assassins.
So these threads, the faith-reason tension, the critique of detached reason, the focus on the individual and the non-rational, they prepare the ground for existentialism. Let's briefly touch on the key existentialist thinkers Barrett focuses on.
Okay, yeah, he brings together figures like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Sartre, seeing them as really confronting these historical tensions head-on.
We've mentioned Kierkegaard's subjective truth, individual choice, the ethico-religious sphere.
Yes, that emphasis on the unique individual, and sometimes needing that suspension of the ethical for a radical faith commitment.
Nietzsche, he presents a different sort of challenge, doesn't he?
Very different. Nietzsche's critique of traditional morality and his idea of the will to power. Barrett interprets this not just as nihilism, but as expressing this powerful, restless energy that drives the modern age after those old certainties collapsed. It's the force behind change and creation in a world after God.
Heidegger goes even deeper, asking about the meaning of being itself.
Right. Heidegger's whole project revolves around that question. Barrett highlights Heidegger's idea of truth, not just as being correct, but as aletheia unhiddenness, revealing things as they truly are. Heidegger thought modern humans have become estranged from being, lost in everyday distractions and the anonymous they, obscuring the fundamental reality of our own existence and its limits, especially death.
And then Sartre, probably the name most people associate with existentialism.
Sartre, yeah. Deeply shaped by his time in the French Resistance, where choices were literally life and death, he puts forward this idea of absolute human freedom. His famous line, "Existence precedes essence," means we're just thrown into the world without a predetermined nature or purpose. We define ourselves completely through our choices.
And denying that freedom, that's bad faith.
Precisely. Pretending you don't have a choice, blaming your past or circumstances, that's bad faith. Barrett talks about how Sartre's plays and novels like Nausea or No Exit really dramatize these ideas. The feeling of disgust at sheer existence, alienation, and how intense and often difficult human relationships are, because other people's freedom can feel like a judgment or a cage.
So, taken together, how does Barrett see these thinkers fundamentally challenging the older philosophical traditions?
Looking through Barrett's lens, these existentialists represent a major shift away from traditional rationalism and metaphysics. They drag philosophy back down to earth, focusing on the concrete, often anxious, reality of being an individual human dealing with subjective truth, radical freedom, and our own finitude, the fact that we're going to die.
Which leads us right into Barrett's central contrast, the integral versus rational man.
Yeah, he sets up this key tension. On one side, you have the dominant figure of modern Western civilization, the rational man, who relies on reason, science, organization, bureaucracy. On the other, you have what he calls the integral, or sometimes the irrational man. He even hints that the sort of classic American anti-intellectual type might capture something of this latter figure.
And this pervasive rationalism, you see it in technology and large organizations. It tries to order everything.
Exactly. It aims for a perfectly efficient, predictable society. But in that drive for control, Barrett warns, it risks crushing individuality, reducing people to stereotypes, and losing touch with the messy, complex reality of human life, creating what sociologist David Riesman famously called the lonely crowd.
To illustrate how ancient this tension is, Barrett uses that powerful example from Greek tragedy.
Aeschylus's Oresteia. That trilogy dramatizes this huge conflict between older, darker, instinctual forces of vengeance, the Furies, and the newer rational forces represented by Apollo, Athena, and the founding of the Athenian law court. The plays end with rational justice being established as the guiding principle for the city.
But crucially, the Furies aren't just wiped out, are they? They're given a new role.
That's the key point. No, they aren't destroyed. They're appeased, transformed into benevolent protectors, the kindly ones, and given a place within the city, albeit underground. Their continued presence suggests that this deep tension between these primal, instinctual, maybe irrational forces and the newer rational order, it's never fully resolved. It's a compromise, a balance that echoes down through Western history.
So pulling it all together, Barrett's core argument seems to be that the rationalist tradition, despite building modern civilization, has ultimately failed to fully understand or persuade the irrational man who operates from different, deeper motivations.
Precisely. Rationalism achieved amazing things, but its hubris, its tendency to think it can control or suppress everything else, risks backfiring, risks being overthrown by its demoniacal opposite, as he dramatically puts it. The real challenge, as Barrett framed it, isn't to eliminate the irrational, but to find a way to forge a pact, to integrate or balance the rational with these deeper, often hidden forces of life before the conflict tears things apart.
Wow. It's such a compelling framework Barrett builds for understanding the modern condition, taking us from the anxiety and art of his time, tracing the roots back through these huge historical tensions, and showing how the existentialists confronted it all.
It really makes you question the limits of a purely rational view and acknowledge those other powerful dimensions of human existence that drive so much of what we do and feel.
And his conclusion seems to be that the way forward isn't about suppressing those irrational parts of ourselves or society, but finding a way to acknowledge them, to integrate them somehow.
It feels like a task that's still very much with us, doesn't it? Individually and collectively. That tension he described, it's definitely still playing out today.
Absolutely. So maybe a final thought to leave you with from this deep dive. In our own world, still dealing with information overload, technological systems, ongoing anxieties, what does Barrett's exploration in Irrational Man suggest about that tension between the rational and the irrational in your own life? How do you personally navigate that balance? Does thinking about this long historical and philosophical conflict maybe give you a different perspective on the world around you right now?